Hey, let's talk about reactive state in the Vue JS framework. Reactivity in Vue JS is one of the things that makes it unique compared to all the other frameworks. However, I think it's also one of the things that's a little bit confusing when you're first getting started. So in this video, we're going to talk about the base fundamentals that you need to have to work with reactivity in Vue JS, specifically with the composition API. So as you can see on the screen here, I just created a new Vue 3 application using npm init Vue at latest, and you can do something similar if you want to follow along. So let's start at the basics. You probably know that you can define variables in JavaScript, right? So if I had a count equals 1 here, we can print this count on the template like so, and you can see that the count 1 is on the side here that's rendered on the page. However, what happens if you want to change this value to update the screen, right? So you might think, okay, let's make this into a let count because I'm going to change it later and maybe introduce a function to increment, and you might think I'll just do count plus plus, right? Just basic JavaScript. Now let's introduce a button that uses this function on our template. So I'll do on click. I'm gonna use increment. And by the way, you'll notice that I'm using script setup here, which is sort of a newer thing in Vue 3. So essentially what that means is any sort of variable that I write within this script block is automatically exposed to my template, right? So I don't have to return or export anything. Anyways, now that we have this button, what happens if we click add? Nothing happens. At least internally, this value might be changing. However, Vue doesn't know about it. So this is where reactive state comes in. So here's your lesson number 1 to create any state that you want to dynamically update while your application is running, whether that's triggered by the user or maybe your server or anything like that. You're going to want to introduce reactive state. So let's refactor this a little bit to change this into an object. Let's say we have an object that, let's just call it obj for short, and we'll bring in this method called reactive, which you'll see is imported from Vue itself. And reactive takes in anything that looks like an object. So for us to represent our count from previously, we're going to do count in here, and we're going to do a default value of 1. And we're going to change our increment to be obj.count plus plus. We also want to make sure that in our template, we update this to be obj.count. Now, if you go back to the browser on the right here, if I click add, now it's reactive. What does that even mean? It basically just means at a very high level is that Vue is now watching any changes that you might do to this object. So anytime you have any sort of state that is not simply static, you're going to want to make it reactive using the reactive method. So let's add a couple more examples here just to kind of paint this picture a little bit better. So let's say that our object also has a list in it, and perhaps it's just an array of strings. And just like our object's count, we can also display this on the template using the v-4 directive. And then maybe in our increment function, let's also add to the list. Right, so what happens now if we hit the add button on the right side, it's going to add to our list, right? And it's going to increment the count. Again, the key thing to notice here is that we're just manipulating the state directly. So this is probably, lesson 1.5 or lesson 2 is that unlike what you might have learned from other frameworks in Vue JS, it actually is encouraged that you just manipulate the state directly. So if you're coming from React, it's probably the thing that you kind of have to unlearn a little bit to, you're used to making things immutable. In this case, no, you're just manipulate it directly. Right though, so to summarize, lesson number 1 is use reactive for state, which changes over time. And lesson number 2, you can simply mutate your properties directly. All right, so let's dive a little bit deeper. You'll notice that with reactive, we passed it an object, but what if we didn't want an object? So let's declare a variable like something, and let's do reactive, and let's just see what happens if we pass in an array. You can see that that's okay. The TypeScript doesn't complain about it. You can also pass in a map, right? Or perhaps a set. And those are all things that are fundamentally still objects behind the scenes, right? But what happens when you pass in primitives? For example, let's do 1. You'll see that there's a squiggly there because TypeScript is telling me you can't use a number when it's expecting a sort of an object type within the parameters here. Same thing if I pass in a boolean, right? Or maybe even just a string. So basically, lesson number 3 is you can't use reactive for primitives. You can only use it for objects, arrays, and collections. Now you might think that's kind of ridiculous. What if I only want to have a basic variable, right, that I want to be reactive, but I also want it to be just a simple primitive? How do you deal with that? Well, you might imagine that perhaps you can just wrap it in an object, right? So let's see if we do something like this. Let's say we provided an object that has a value property, and then perhaps that value contains the value of the variable that you're trying to define. So let's say that we have let's call this count again, right? You just have a variable that is just called count. And let's initialize this to 1 as well, right? So that effectively now works sort of like how you wanted it to work, where you have basically a count variable. And just like how we had it before, you can just use that in the template using count that value, right? So if we change our original here to be count that value, and then maybe let's just change this to be count that value plus plus, right? So it's not using the method that we had here. It's kind of just being inlined. So you can see that that still works. So you can see that that effectively solves our problem, where if you want to use a primitive, you could just use reactive with an object and a value property, and then whatever primitive you have, you just provide it into the value, and then you can just change it like you changed it before. But as you might imagine, this can get painful very quickly because, you know, you're going to have to do dot value everywhere in the template. And that's the same thing as if we had a increment 2 here. Let's say that we were trying to do our increment inside our script. Same thing, you have to do count that value plus plus, right? So that's the same thing, but again, you have to constantly remember to access the value, the dot value property whenever you're trying to get the value or whenever you're trying to manipulate the value. So since this pattern of having basically an object wrapper to do primitives is so common, what Vue did is they actually introduced what's called a ref, right? If we do ref instead of reactive, and we're going to import that from Vue as well, what they basically did was now you can just do something like this, which you can see that it does allow you to take in any primitive, right? So it can be a number, it can be a boolean, it can be a string. So this is effectively a shorthand for what we had before, right? Which is a reactive object with a value property. So you can see that if you're trying to increment within the script, you still have to access the value through that value. However, it has a special property to it where in the template, you'll see that there's a squiggly here. In the template, it actually is sort of automatically unwrapped. So you don't need to use dot value within the template. It sort of just magically knows that, hey, this is of type ref, so I'm going to access the value of this using the dot value property. But that only works in the template. There is other workarounds that is sort of in the pipeline review for this that I'll talk about, which is called the Reactivity Transform, but we'll get back to that later. But again, when we test this, you'll see that this is effectively the same thing, right? So to wrap up our lesson number 3, for primitives, you want to use ref. Now, in addition to simply using ref or reactive variables for primitives, you can also pass in objects in here, which might make you ask, well, if we can do that, what's the point of using reactive, right? So let's talk about some of the pain points with reactive, which might make you want to use ref with objects instead. So let's clean up our examples here a little bit, and let's go back to our original obj.count and increment. So we're back to our original example, and actually let's simplify this even more to just have the count in it. And let's remove our list. So let's imagine that you have a scenario where perhaps you want to reset the count, or just in general you want to replace the values of the original object or the current object that you have, right? So let's add a method called reset, and we'll expose that method in our template using another button using that reset, call it reset. And let's think about how might we implement a reset here in this case, right? So you could imagine that perhaps you want to do just a straight up object replace, right? Assign it to a new object with a count of 1, right? That could be one way. But does that work? First of all, we need to make this a let so that I don't get the red squiggly. But let's see how this performs, right? If I hit add, I'm able to add but when I reset, it doesn't do anything. And why is that? That's because if you think about it this way, what we did with this line is we essentially told Vue, hey, Vue, pay attention to this variable. It's a reactive state, and anytime the state changes, update the UI, right? And we essentially said obj is just a reference to this piece of reactive state. Now, the moment that you reassign obj to something else, what you effectively did was you just severed that connection to the reactive state, so you no longer have access to manipulate it or see the current value of it. So it kind of, the reactive state in this case kind of becomes an orphan if you think about it that way. So that's not really a great solution. Now you can maybe imagine that, all right, why don't we just do what we did before, right? Just directly manipulate the count like this. And if we test that, that works great. However, if you have a massive object, right? Our example here is very small. If you have a massive object, that's going to get really painful very fast if you have to do that for every single property. So what is the actual solution here? What you need to do is actually use object.assign. And what that's going to do is effectively allow you to merge your original reactive object with a new object, but it doesn't sever that reactive connection. So as an example, if we do obj here, and we're trying to merge it with an object that has count1 as well, if we test it out, we can add, and reset still works, right? So that's a little bit cleaner, especially when you potentially could have a massive state object here with a bunch of properties. This will be a lot simpler. So what that would allow you to do is something like, you could pull out this object to a static initial state, and we can then use it like this. Now the only catch here, you'll notice this is actually broken if I test it out right now. If I do reset, you'll notice it doesn't reset. And that's because you want to make sure that you're spreading this into a new object. And you have to do that just so that Vue sort of knows all of the properties. You essentially have to sort of simulate it being created from scratch, right? So that's why we're spreading into a new object. So if we test that right now, that still works. Now, what I'm really trying to point out here is you can see that you can sort of simulate a reset. However, it's very painful, right? You have to do all of these things. Like you got to object.assign, you got to do this, spreading trick thing. Is there a way that we can do this a little bit better? And that's where ref comes back into save the day. So let's refactor this to be a ref. We said that ref is not only for primitives, but you can also use it for objects. So remember that because it's a ref, we now have to refactor our obj count here to be accessed within value. And in the template, again, because it's being automatically unwrapped, we don't have to do that value down there. But now in the reset, we can simplify this to simply just be obj.value equals initial state. However, the only catch here is you're going to want to do the spread here as well, because if we simply assign it to, now point to this, anytime that count changes, when you reset, it just goes back to the current state. So that's broken as well. So now if we go back to our browser, this should work. Right, so I would argue this is a little bit simpler, but end of the day, it is sort of preference. Now, the whole issue with breaking the reactivity is actually a problem in other places that we need to talk about. And the most common place that might happen is actually when you attempt to destructure. So to show this off, let's actually go back a couple steps back to our previous code. So I'm just going to do Control-Z here a couple times. All right, so we're back to our original 3 lessons. I added a note here that, ref is for primitives, but it can also be useful for objects, as we just talked about. Now let's go back to using our original reactive object, and let's switch this back to obj.count and our original increment. And let's just clean this up, right? So we're back to this. Now, something you notice in the template is, we're accessing a bunch of properties out of obj. And as you might imagine, if you have a massive object, you're going to be doing obj dot something over and over again across your template. So the intuition here might be, can I use destructuring to clean this up? Let's give it a shot. So if I do something like count and list equals obj and destructure that out of the reactive object, what happens if I refactor this to just be count and list? And do we still have the same working solution? What happens if we hit add? you'll notice that it still adds to the list, but the count is now sort of frozen. And that's because what we effectively did was, just like before where we talked about how you might accidentally sever the connection, the reactive connection, that's exactly what we did with count. But it effectively just becomes a copy of the value, right? It's as if you made a new variable, but it's no longer referencing that original reactive count. Now the list still works because that's still, it's an array, it's sort of like an object, so it's able to still reference this, original, think of it as like a nested reactive value. So that seems kind of painful. So how do you fix something like this? Well, what we need to do is bring in toRefs, and we pass an object here. And all that does is effectively, it just turns the individual properties of obj, or the object you pass in, to effectively individual references to the underlying reactive values. So if we now go back to our browser again and hit add, now it's working the same way as before, where we're able to update the list and the count. Right, so I would say, what are we at? Lesson number 4. Remember, don't destructure without toRefs. Okay, so always remember to use toRefs anytime you're trying to destructure. And this is actually very useful, specifically in scenarios where you're creating composables. So composables in Vue is sort of the equivalent of hooks from the React ecosystem. But basically, imagine that you have a function, perhaps that composable has your reactive values and methods, right? Like imagine that obj is in here. A typical pattern might be to return, instead of just returning obj, which is the reference to the underlying reactive object, you might return toRefs obj. And why is that? That's so that you can have a, just like in hooks in React, you can have an API where you're able to destructure the return values, and these are automatically still, correctly reactive, and they don't sever that connection, right? So this is a typical pattern that you see with composables, where you're destructuring values out of the return. So toRefs is extremely important to know about, right? Because without it, you might accidentally sever the connection if you destructure things out of your reactive value, right? So that's core lesson number 4. Now at this point, a good question to ask is, what should I generally use? Should I use reactive or should I use ref? And like I said, it is sort of preference, but I do believe that ultimately ref is the most flexible one out of the two, right? And let me change this again to ref. Right, so this is equivalent to what we just had before, except now we're using ref instead of reactive. The only real pain point in my mind is that we have to constantly do dot value within the script. It does nicely unwrap for us in the template, but within the script, it's still sort of kind of just annoying to keep having to access dot value. It's something that you have to remember. Although something to know about is if you're using Volar, or the recommended extension for Vue 3, you'll notice that one of the things that it does is it automatically adds dot value for you. So pay attention to when I type in obj here. You'll see that it automatically added dot value. That wasn't me. I didn't hit tab or anything like that. That was automatically done by that extension. So as soon as I hit J, it adds dot value. So it kind of does help you a little bit to get through that pain point. So to a degree, I would say that ref is generally, if you're not sure which one to use, ref is probably the most flexible of the two, if you can sort of deal with that pain point. Now, here's sort of lesson number 5. There is experimental support for what's called the Reactive Transform, and let's take a look at what that does. So to enable Reactive Transform, I'm going to go in my Vue config, and within this Vue plugin, I can actually add some options like Reactivity Transform True. And I also need to add a reference to the type for Vue macros global, because that plugin, this configuration, adds stuff to the global scope, and we need to let TypeScript know about it. With that in place, we can actually refactor this to be $ref. So it's effectively sort of the same exact thing. I'm going to clean this up. I don't actually need the imports anymore because this is global. And you can see that as soon as I change that to $ref, the value here is now in red squiggly because now we can get rid of this and go back to, so effectively we're able to go back to the slightly cleaner reactive function where you can just access things directly without going through the value property. And that still works as well for the template. So let's do a quick test. You know, you can still add the same as before. So overall, if you kind of put all the things together, right, you can think of it as ref is ultimately the most flexible solution. And with the reactivity transform, it sort of removes, it auto unwraps for you within the script, and it already unwraps for you within the template. So it just becomes very clean, you know, across the board. However, like I said, reactivity transform is an experimental feature right now. That's why you have to explicitly opt into it. So it's not final yet in the Vue ecosystem, but I could see this being really something that people would want. And it does have a couple other things in it, like you can do the same thing with, you know, computed properties, and there's a couple other macros that, you know, if you want to learn more about this and you think I should make a video about it, let me know. But I don't think I'd add it into this video because it is still experimental, so I wouldn't consider it a fundamental thing to learn at this point. So in the short term, you know, you could just keep using the dot value property, or you can try this experimental transform support. Alright guys, that's it for me today. Hopefully that was a good overview for you. If you got any feedback from me, let me know in the comments, and do make sure to like and subscribe if you want to see more. Anyways, I hope to see you in the next video.